My name is Jay Sugarman, and I want to welcome you to Museum Open House. This ongoing series features and highlights many of the outstanding museums and other cultural institutions. The main purpose of most programs is to inform viewers about current and upcoming exhibits, various programs, resources, and other opportunities that are available for the general public. Today, via Zoom, we're fortunate to have as our guest Joel Levinson. Joel is a highly accomplished, award-winning architect and interior designer. He's also the founder and curator of the Daring Diagonal Virtual Museum, a museum dedicated to the geometric design and pattern of diagonality that appears in art, architecture, and various design-related fields and disciplines. During the program, we're learning why and how the museum came about and how it operates today. We'll go on a behind the scenes tour, and in the process, we'll come to better understand and appreciate the museum's overall mission and the wide range of ways that diagonality both occurs and is used in architecture and other related fields. Let's start by meeting Joel and then finding out all about the Daring Diagonal Virtual Museum. Welcome, Joel. So delighted you're able to be here.
Jay, I'm delighted too, and I really appreciate your including me in these programs. It's a great opportunity for the museum to become known around the world. The doors are open 24 hours a day.
It's amazing. I mean, it was fascinating for me to first read about the work you've been doing for many years now with the topic of diagonality, and then tour the virtual museum really brought it all together for me. I'm eager to learn much more and have you inform viewers. Before we jump right to that, I also think it would be of interest if you'd please start by sharing just briefly a little of your background and professional interests.
Sure. So I was trained at the University of Pennsylvania to be an architect. You're required to spend 3 years before you can open your own office. I immediately did. Had a number of projects, best known for my residential work. Then I expanded into interior design. I've also been a photographer all my life and have photographed many instances of diagonality around the world. I'm also a published author. I published a novel and I'm an essayist, and those essays appear in part in the museum. I'm also interested in science and a theorist in that regard as well.
Yeah, I mean, the range of topics that the museum covers is outstanding. One can spend many a day going from, as we'll see, how the galleries are arranged from gallery to gallery, topic to topic. As we jump in, maybe it'd be helpful to start by just a very brief definition of diagonality and just tracing a little of the history of the phenomenon and your interest in it.
Sure. So oftentimes when I introduce the subject by telling somebody that I'm interested in diagonality, I get that big question mark, like, what on earth are you talking about? And then once I explain it, they call me back and they say, I see it everywhere. And I keep getting reports to that effect. So diagonality, if you think of graph paper with the lines at right angles, that's the orthogonal grid. If you were to take those lines that are in a grid and angle them, you might say that's diagonality.
Mhm.
Buildings all through history have, for the most part, been organized along the orthogonal grid, right angles. Easy to build, efficient to, for instance, even to cut a piece of timber or a stone. If you cut on an angle, you're going through more material. So cutting it at the right angle makes sense. So the other thing is the gravity. You don't put up a column on an angle generally. You have it be straight up so that it doesn't fall over. So some of those forces were what propelled architecture in particular to be orthogonal based, right angle based. In the 19th century, there were a number of things that happened that set the stage for the emergence of diagonality, a geometric theme that occurred in the 20th century. It actually started just a little bit at the end of the 19th century. Frank Lloyd Wright was experimenting with diagonal lines in his work. And then in the 20th century, it just exploded. I mean, it was everywhere. There were a lot of names for this. There was constructivism, cubism,
Hmm.
Rayonism, and so that pervaded the art world in a lot of paintings and sculptures that were far from orthogonal, and that and architecture as well. So it was in a very short time that this new geometric motif, which expressed dynamism, activity, a modern world, just burst on the scene in every country in the world.
Hmm.
You see it everywhere. I've traveled around the world, and I'm surprised where find it by chance, and I attempt to photograph it as well. Um, and there were forces all through history leading up to the 19th century that were kind of tamping down diagonality. When you think of the phrase, do the right thing, it certainly is not doing the slanted thing, right? So even language was suppressing the emergence of diagonality. But there were other forces that were fostering it in a way. And there were instances that I have recorded in the museum where diagonality has appeared in architecture and art through the ages. And then, of course, 20th century, whammo, and is continuing today all over the world.
How did and why did you come up with the museum and the great title?
Oh, um, so when I was at the University of Pennsylvania studying to become an architect, I think I was in my third year. And most of the projects that all the students were doing were kind of right angle based, square corners. And then one afternoon, I noticed that some students were adding triangular additions to their blocky schemes or cutting a triangular section out of it like a piece of pie. And I thought to myself, what is going on here? This is strange, right? So it just struck me that something is new here. And of course, that was an age of rebellion, in the 60s, protest. And when you think of the slash of a diagonal, that very much expresses the age of protest of the 60s.
Hmm.
So I began to, cut out clippings from magazines. I took a look at what our professors were doing. They were starting to, use the diagonal in a great way. And I started to make little notes and accumulated files and so on. And then I started to write a book on diagonality, The Daring Diagonal, I was calling it. And then I figured, well, this book may never get written. I'm going to create a website. And the first website was Center for the Study of Diagonality in World Culture. And that was well received. And it was just by chance that I had a conversation with a company that does websites. And I said, I'd like to create a virtual museum. Can you do that with me? And that's how the project got started. And that was about a year ago.
Mhm.
So I've been taking the earlier essays, revising them, adding more material. I mean, what I have in the museum, which you said is a lot to begin with, is just the tip of a huge iceberg of material.
Wow. Wow. We're going to jump right in and see how it's laid out shortly. But I know you've come up with this wonderful rendering for the museum. Just before we move on to the different galleries, just a few words of your design here and what you made sure to include.
Sure. So when I thought about this virtual museum, you think museum, well, it has rooms, it's a building. And there was no building. So I said, well, maybe I'll take one of the houses that I designed and I will use that as the model for the museum. That will be, in a sense. So this visual is actually a rendering of a house that I designed, the Kimball residence. And I took the floor plan of it and I adjusted it so it was simpler, more museum-like in terms of galleries. And I assigned a topic for each of the rooms. Uh, there, although this house has 3 levels, one is a basement, the virtual museum has 3 levels, and there are about 33 galleries. So that's, and in the museum, if somebody's curious about what the house actually looks like, there's a place in the museum one can actually visit that house through images.
And here we see the 3 sort of floors, 3 sort of major areas, and we're going to step into each of them and just a quick word of some of the things viewers can look forward to investigating and exploring when they go to the site. Here, education outreach.
Yeah, this is education outreach. It's a kind of a general level. And Gallery 1.3 has photographs of diagonality that I took all over the world. They're just images, there's no identification. In Gallery 110, that circular space, which is actually the great room or living room of the Kimball residence, I changed the exhibits there periodically, so there's always a freshness to the museum. The Gallery 1.8 has the beginnings of the book on diagonality. There are 3 chapters there, a preface, an introduction, and then a chapter on the right angle. This house has an atrium, and that's gallery number 1.11. So if you get exhausted looking at exhibits, you can look up into the skylight of the atrium.
Fabulous.
And there's, I have a gallery where there are works by children. People can submit their children's works. And gallery 1.14 is World Reporters, where people with just their camera can see an instance of diagonality in their hometown, and they can send it. And if it's appropriate for the museum, we'll post it.
Let's move on here. This one I found particularly fascinating to get a even richer, deeper handle from some of your readings on the historical progression and nature of diagonality, the chronology section. A couple of words about this area.
Yeah, so it starts with ancient Egypt. Of course, everybody's familiar with pyramids. They're not so familiar with the ramps that were built and also rotated axes. Maybe I'm getting into too much detail, but those are what I call the antecedents of diagonality. It's not a precursor. A precursor would have to be something done, and then a year later, it generates or triggers another example of diagonality. So I go through the different periods from, ancient Egypt, Greece and Rome, the Middle Ages. And then when I get to the 20th century, the 19th century is just a single century. I think the Age of Progress, Gallery 2.7. And then the 20th century and 21st century are broken down into 25-year increments.
Mhm, mhm. And the last major area before we step in and see some fabulous examples, disciplines and themes.
Yeah, disciplines and themes. Well, obviously architecture, because I'm an architect. I know a little bit about that. Engineering and space frames. There's something called the isms. I mentioned that before: cubism, constructivism. There's a section that deals with that. That's Gallery 3.12, the isms. Fortifications and social revolution. One thing that I kind of stumbled upon, not completely a surprise, was that there have been instances through history where diagonality has kind of poked its head up. And that's been during periods of social revolution. So there's a correlation, not necessarily causation, but a correlation between periods of diagonality and social revolution. And fortification, you think of the star forts and things that have these angular perimeters. Um, it even shows up in fashion, landscape design. It's really permeated every design discipline that humans have been involved in through history.
Mhm. Well, we're going to move on to some wonderful examples that you've assembled for us. So as we come up to them, just a little highlight of what we're seeing and some of the key features for us to maybe pay attention to that we might not be picking up ourselves.
Sure. So this is a building in New York. We're talking about the black steel portion of it.
Mm.
It's in addition to an existing factory. And you can see all the other structures are right angle. The windows are all vertical and everything is right angle. And here it's as if, forceful wind came and just twisted the steel frame. And clearly it was done for the visual impact. The addition of this black structure is almost a billboard for
Mm.
the building, for the company. And
Fabulous.
this is, you can see this from the High Line in New York.
Wonderful. This is exquisite. What are we seeing here?
This is, I had seen it published before I went to Japan. In, I had to see this building. This is the Budokan outside of Tokyo. Uh, you would think that, well, he did some diagonality near the entrance. You walk around the entire building, every square inch has expressions of diagonality. It's truly amazing. Done by a Japanese architect, and I think it's some sort of a sports or martial arts center. There is another Budokan for performances. That's a separate building, not this one.
Mm. Just roughly, how long has this been around?
This building, this is, I think, the 60s. Did I bring my notes with me?
Mhm.
I have them downstairs. About, I think, the 60s or 70s. And
Nice.
the other building, the black structure, that's this 20th century.
Okay.
Actually, even very early in this decade of, yeah. And this is the building I stumbled on. It's under construction in Serbia. I don't know the architect. I don't know the exact date.
Mm.
Um, and it brings up a question, and that is, was diagonality on the mind of the engineer that worked out this structure? Um, I think diagonality is in the bloodstream of designers and architects and artists. No one uses the term diagonality. It's a phrase that existed. It's a word that existed before I used it, but I've used it to describe this phenomenon of the use of this geometric motif.
But I have to say, as you've mentioned in some of your readings and earlier remarks today, it's like learning a new vocabulary word. When you are aware of it, I know myself, I'm starting to look as I walk around buildings to catch examples of it. It's just sort of always in my mind now, walking around to pick out those instances when I can appreciate this type of style and design.
Yeah, and you see it on TV and advertisements. It's quite pervasive.
Most definitely, most definitely.
So
And here,
this is a phonograph and radio cabinet. I think this was done in the 50s by an artist, cabinet maker, famous Wharton Esherick. This piece is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and nearby is an entire fireplace that he designed, all with diagonals. And he was connected with Lou Kahn, a famous 20th century architect, who has done some, where diagonality has been pervasive through his work as well.
mhm, mhm.
But you can see the pattern in that, in the woodworking there. Uh, you know, the cutouts to pull the drawer open, even
Oh,
the whole shape of the piece is, you know, it could be just a block, but it has this dynamism. That's what the diagonality adds. It's not static. It implies motion.
that's a terrific description. Another very interesting design here.
Yeah, you know, it looks three-dimensional. Sometimes when I look at it, I think it's three-dimensional, you know, with that point on the left coming out at you, but it's a flat painting. And it has the three-dimensional effect additionally because you look like you're looking into a three-dimensional space. So this is a kind of reminiscent of the Platonic solids, uh,
Mm,
you know, that Plato had worked up and so on. Yeah, so this I saw in New York in a museum. I don't know if it was part of their permanent exhibit or not.
mhm.
Ah, Antonio Gaudí. Now, you know, this building was started in 1883
Hmm.
and it's still under construction. They're still building towers, you know, that just go into the heavens. And just look at the diagonality in this
Oh,
with those angular concrete structural struts and so on. And the element on the left looks like it has a wire coming out of it. All of those diagonal cuts in that. So he was way ahead of his time, Gaudi, in every aspect of his creative efforts.
where is this located?
This is in Barcelona, Spain.
Mm, wow.
And that was before the cathedral was open. It is now open to the public and finished, and very colorful too. So this is you're looking at an escalator that takes you up to the main level of an addition that was put on a building that Randolph Hearst had constructed. And so you can see the angled columns and the angle of the escalator, and that's a water element in the middle of the picture. Water flows down these angled glass steps. And this is the Hearst Tower, and that the whole exterior of it has these kind of bird mouth cutouts as the building rises. And that was done by Sir Norman Foster,
Mm,
an English architect.
mhm.
And that's about around 2000 or 2010, in that range. So this is a museum, a Jewish contemporary history museum in San Francisco.
Mm.
The architect's name is escaping me, but it might come to me in a moment. And there's a church in the background there, but behind that kind of flipped up cube is a very conventional original section of the museum. And this certainly catches your eye as you look down this alley and you see this addition to the building. I don't know how well it works functionally, but it is eye-catching, and that's part of the problem. Have some way to get the people into the museum, right?
Mhm. What's been some of the reaction and feedback, both from professional colleagues and general public to your work, to the museum?
For the museum. So when I told fellow students that I was working on this idea of diagonality, there were words for it back in the 60s and 70s. Uh, um, I'm drawing a blank on it at the moment, but oh, they said, oh, that fad, you know, died out long ago. That just, you know, what are you talking about? And I believe they were wrong. I'm now certain they were wrong because it's zaps and zoots. Those were the terms used back in the 60s to refer to these triangular additions of the cutout, the pie-shaped cutouts of the buildings. And it has just evolved in a variety of ways, much more complex than it was dealt with back in the time I was a student.
Mhm.
So this is the stair of a house, the Mazer residence, that I was commissioned to design about 25 years ago. It's in Chilmark, which is in Martha's Vineyard. And the house generally is orthogonal, except for some trusses, which are quite diagonal. But because diagonality had expanded my own vocabulary of forms and shapes, I introduced this diagonally positioned stair, or I kind of opened the stair up in a diagonal way so that when you come in from the left, you can't see the entrance. It just invites you upstairs as opposed to having to make a bunch of right hand and left hand turns.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you.
And here, moving to a different field and discipline.
Yes. This is a painting at the Philadelphia Museum of Art called The Fencers. Benton Spruance is the artist. This goes back, I think, to the 30s or 40s. And you can see that, I don't know whether Spruance had any idea what diagonality was. How could he? It did, as an idea, it didn't exist back then. But you can see well, first of all, the gestures of the fencers, and also the other elements, the floor, the walls, are all kind of exploded and given that dynamism that is the essence of diagonality.
Most definitely, it really comes through there.
Yeah. So this is a building that is in outside of Paris. It's a museum designed for Louis Vuitton. It's the Foundation Louis Vuitton by Frank Gehry. And this was done about 20 years ago. And I call Gehry a gestural architect. Some architects are not painters and sculptors the way Gehry is. He lives art, and he has the freedom to take structure and shapes and just twist them, in a sense, to his pleasure. I mean, the building has to work, and this is such an exciting building to go through. This is just one image of many that I took that capture where he employs this diagonal element in the leaning and flaring columns that support the upper level.
What's some of your current and upcoming work in mind with regard to the museum and this field in general?
Well, I'm obviously going to continue to write essays for the museum and post them, and also to continue working on the book. And I'm working with a physicist friend of mine who's editing it. He offered to edit it after I gave a lecture. He came up to me and he said, "You have to write that book and I'll edit it."
Wow.
What I'm hoping is that someone with a whole lot of money, but not a whole lot of money, enough money, will say, "Hey, Joel, this museum deserves a brick and mortar place where people can see the paintings and the models, the architectural models, the sculpture, the tapestries, and so on." So I'm hoping that will happen maybe in my lifetime, maybe later. So I'm just pressing ahead with what I can do to promulgate the idea of diagonality.
Oh, that type of brick and mortar museum would be incredibly well received, as is the virtual museum. Can't endorse it enough and encourage viewers to make the way to the website, which will be in the credits, and spend many a day, many a good hour exploring the various galleries that we just gave a little snippet of in our conversation. So I want to thank you so much for sharing your time with us, your incredibly interesting work, and continued success with upcoming and future efforts.
Jade, thank you so much for including me in your exposure of the different projects to the world at large. Much appreciated.
Most
Thank you.
definitely. Also want to thank those of you watching for joining us and hope you'll be able to tune in next time.